This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
I feel like we could begin. Okay, let's get started, guys. I was just waiting then for the recording to begin. So that's a great reminder to me that these lectures are recorded. I had to set that up, so I think you would have only had access on Sunday, but you should get access to them fairly quickly now after the lecture is completed. If you haven't seen that, it's the slides with my very Australian accent talking. So I hope that can reinforce lectures for you as you need those. I've got a lot to get through today, and I want to get through to showing you a scheme amendment at the end, but we're going to cover a bit of material, and that's going to mainly be what is a planning scheme, go down to some of the fundamentals of that, how that actually works in a beginning sense, and how an amendment, a change to the planning scheme occurs. I'll also introduce assignment 1 and talk a bit about the worksheets, but I'll say now, just to reinforce, I would really like you to complete worksheet 1 prior to beginning the assignment, because it gives you the basics to make it much more efficient for you to conduct that assignment. And I'll put a note there. By the way, this lighting, does that make it easy to read? Or should I make it darker? Seems like it's okay? Okay. So lecture capture I've talked about. The book, I had a few emails about do we need to buy the book. You will need to do the readings. Maybe you could creatively share with another person, but I would also suggest you might benefit from taking the book into the exam as well. So under the Copyright Act, I'm not allowed to copy the whole book and post it on our LMS. If we did that, no publishers would ever make any money and we'd get no books published. Plus, it's not fair on the person who wrote it. So he is my friend, but I don't get a commission. So it's the sort of book, if you're going to have something to do with statutory planning, and presumably that's why you're here, it's a pretty good book to have on the shelf. So I've tried to restrict the number of things you need to purchase, but that might be one of them. The other thing I would mention is the Act. You will need a copy for the exam. I will be asking questions that relate to the Act as part of a question, remembering that I don't require you to have a hard copy of the scheme. The scheme is this thick, double-sided A4. So you don't need that for the exam, you don't need to buy it. And if you're online, you can access those easily on laptops or tablets or whatever. Okay, so this one, you can print them out, but if I can, I get the bound copy. It's just a bit neater and you can put post-its in and stuff, it just seems a bit easier. So you can buy them online or do the download. So, what are we going to look at today? The first thing is just what is an Act? Please come in, guys. An Act of Parliament. And what's it do and how is it relating to the planning scheme? What I have here is the Planning Environment Act as one of 3 fairly important acts that often operate in conjunction with each other. In fact, the list could be quite wide. Heritage Act might be another one, and so forth. But if we just concentrate here, we've got this head of power, it's a law, it's part of our democratic system, that this provides the rules in simple terms. And underneath that, there are agencies that do things, that are empowered, given jobs to do, given responsibilities by the Act. Often that is local authorities being a planning authority or a responsible authority. I could also here have put under legislation the Local Government Act, because that provides a lot of the background powers and responsibilities for local government in Australian states. Then we have all the policies, plans, regulations that get their head of legislative or legal power from the Act, but then are put to work by a range of different policies, plans and regulations. And I suppose also here I could have included planning schemes as well, as in the planning scheme for the City of Port Phillip or the City of Melbourne. So these are all the things that are used to make decisions and that relate to places when you want to do things. Then of course there's a whole bunch of processes that go on, things that happen day to day, giving permits, refusals, making assessments, etc. Then of course at the bottom, really the important bit is all of the outcomes we get. So good planning decisions, try and avoid pollution going into the environment, try and manage lakes and rivers and streams, and so forth. So really what I'm trying to reinforce is that the real power of the planning system comes out of the Act. But you won't really find the Act very easy to understand if you just work your way through it without understanding the processes and the roles of the different agencies. So it's not an easy read. Although after this you'll have that under your pillow every night, just soaking it in as we take you through the process. So let's just think what an Act of Parliament is. These sound obvious, but you need to put them together. It achieves a desired purpose. And what's the purpose of this Act? Well, let's do it properly, and I'll teach one other thing at the same time, is that as people studying statutory planning and planning law, you need to know where to go to find out the actual source of information, the legislative or regulatory or policy-based information. So one of the things you might need to learn fairly soon, and if you've got a device open right now, you might want to just go straight to it. AustLII, Australian Legal Information Institute. It's written there. Now this is a brand new website, so you'll have to bear with me. You know what, I'll go back to here because I know how to run this one. So there's a new website you might want to become familiar with, but just to not waste too much time, cases and legislation. So this is an amazing resource for all kinds of things to do with law and policy and decision making. We'll go to Victoria. You can see there's a whole bunch of case law there, and then there's legislation, current acts, and then I'll go to P for Planning and Environment, and then Planning and Environment Act 1987, and it's all here, okay? So these you can click through as little links, but also you can go here and you can download a copy in a PDF or RTF form. That's probably all. I won't do that right now, but if someone said to me, well, an act exists to achieve a purpose, we had a new style of writing acts from the late 70s here in Victoria, the plain English process or protocol, and in that they're meant to be relatively easy to understand in normal English. I'm not sure if that's completely true, but it means they don't have all kinds of legalese and Latin and obscure meanings in there, so a little bit easier to read. And look what they say. The purpose of this Act is to establish a framework planning use, development and protection of land in Victoria in the present and long-term interests of all Victorians. So you might want to open it up now, and I'll pose, or you might have a hard copy, I don't know. But this thinking of going back to the source of the information is really vital, and I'll show you more and more of that as we go through. So let's go back to the presentation. And what is the rationale of an Act of Parliament? To achieve a desired purpose. We just looked at that. It's the policy of an elected government. They try and pass legislation, and at this time there was a need and a desire politically to change the Background Act. Powers and responsibilities to certain agencies. It's a way of regulating. It says who must do things. Importantly, it sets out key processes that need to be followed as the law. And if you don't comply with the law, there are penalties. So, we're not dealing with criminal law here, but it still requires compliance, and for legitimacy for a planning scheme, it needs to go through a series of steps that are the amendment process. For a permit, it needs to go through a series of steps before it has weight and is enforceable and lets you build. Otherwise, action will be taken against you. So that's the Act. And if we think now about, well, what are the main things in this Act? And I do this because, as I said, if you try and just read it, it's pretty hard to understand. You probably wouldn't. So if you look across the Act, you'll find these are the main components. It tells you its purpose, its objectives, what different words mean. It tells you that the planning schemes applies to land. Sets out what a planning scheme has to have in it. Who does what? Key procedures, we looked at these very briefly last week. How to make a scheme or prepare it, and how to implement it through permit applications and decisions. Who else gets to be involved? So who are these three parties? There's third parties. So who knows who are these three parties if it's talking about third party participation? Planners are one of the parties, or probably the responsible authority, to use the language of the Act. So they'll make decisions on permits. Who's the second party? It's the applicant, the person applying. Actually, it could be reversed, it doesn't really matter. Who's the third party? The public, other agencies, people who might have something to say. So third party participation, the Act sometimes sets out processes for that, when it can and can't happen, and indeed the planning scheme also sets those things out. So again, you're in local government and you're saying, well, I want to have a say, and the local planner says, well, I don't feel like letting you. And I said, well, actually, in the Act, it's section X, Y, and Z, it says I have a right. So I'll take you to some of those things as well. Very, very important. And of course, enforcement when people don't comply. So you might want to have a look at section 1 in the Act itself, but I won't flip back and forth between those two. But if you go to section 1, it sets out a framework for planning use, development and protection of land in Victoria in the present long-term interests of all Victorians. Now, you'll notice one thing here, it says section. And if you look in the Act, the numbers down the side are unique identifiers within this Act of different sections. Maybe I will go back out and look at this. So if we go back one. So section 2, you'll see up here, section 2, and then it's section 2, part 1, and section 2, part 2. So sometimes you will want to refer very precisely to a bit of the planning scheme. And indeed that's very necessary. And in an Act, they're called sections. And I won't tell you the other contrasting one now, so that is reinforced. Okay, so that's an important distinction. We call these components sections in the Act. Okay, so section 3, key definitions. These are very, very important because our general or common use of some words is not the same as what the Act calls a building, say, or a development. These are very, very important distinctions, and of course these could have huge implications for what can and can't happen on a piece of land, or whether or not someone is allowed to get involved. So if the definitions are not in the Act or in the planning scheme, and they're just general words, we use the Macquarie Dictionary, which is the Australian dictionary with an Australian meaning. But if they're in here, they're exactly what the Act says it is. So probably the most important thing here is building is anything that has been built on the land. So that might be sheds and outbuildings, could be an outside toilet, a granny flat, or even a fence. So you can start to see that that's probably pretty important when it says a permit is required for building. So what's included in that? Or is there an exclusion? Development is when we build something, when we modify something, this is not working very well, remove it or even demolish a structure on a piece of land. Again, that precise meaning is very important. And this other one here, subdivision, is also important. Does anyone know what subdivision is? You were nodding. Perfect. So you have a piece of land and you divide it in a legal sense into different properties to sell on for inheritance purposes. And it might not be just dividing it. We include in this state subdivision including joining together pieces of land as well. We include that in subdivision in the definition. Okay, so the planning system here also controls subdivision of land. That can have important implications because, say, you're in a farming zone, often there will be a minimum size that you can subdivide land to. Anyone want to guess why we'd say that? Why would we restrict the minimum size of farming land so, you don't get 100 square metre lots out in the middle of farming land? Yeah, we want good quality farmland to be maintained for farming purposes, and if we divide it up, we have a lot of experience of this before we had controls. That farmland is usually not very efficient, often a lot of environmental degradation to it as well. When we use the word land, it's the dirt on the legal boundary and the building. So again, this is a very specific meaning in the Act. So what do you do if someone disputes you? You go to the definitions in section 3 of the Act. So this is very, very important because this general principle of the statutory basis runs through most of the things that we do. A road. Again, I sort of go to these ones because they're important and often people need to pay attention to these. Here we're talking about the legal boundaries of the road, not just the hard surface or gravel or asphalt that we've created. So it's the whole road reserve, and that might include sidewalks and footpaths, or in country areas, vegetation on the sides of roads or drains and ditches and things. So road, in planning terms, according to the Act, is the whole road reserve. Does that make sense? So it's quite a specific meaning. Use is the activity or the main purpose that is going on the land. So does someone want to give me an example of an activity or a main purpose of a piece of something happening on a piece of land?
Residential use.
Bang on. Residential. What's another one? Commercial. Okay, you get the idea. So uses, there are actually many defined uses, and I won't take you to them right now, but this is also very, very important for two main reasons. One, some uses are allowed and some are not often. But also, use is distinguished very importantly from development throughout the planning scheme. And sometimes we say all development requires a permit. And so that is distinguished from use. And I'll talk about that as we go through the coming weeks and give lots and lots of examples of use versus development. So that's exactly the sort of thing that will be in the exam. Works is essentially changing the land, the vegetation, digging ditches, excavating, things like that. And sometimes we say works needs a permit. Why might that be the case sometimes and not others? If you think of people digging up land and things, there's all kinds of reasons potentially, but could be contaminated soil. Yep, that's right. It might modify water flows or have geotechnical implications. It might be related to environmental concerns and so forth. You know, you might not remember all these straight away, but you certainly need to know that the Act is setting them out in fairly precise terms. And just to reinforce it, difference between use and development. So we use a vacant bit of land to operate, say, a market where things are bought and sold. And that's significantly different to developing it as in building structures that are permanent with roofs and walls and might need a building permit as well. So, for example, if we're in a business zone, use of an existing vacant site for a shop is actually consistent with that zone. You might just set up a temporary table and start doing it, and it would be allowed. Assuming you're meeting other rules like health and safety and food laws and things like that. But if you want to build a shop, that's development. If you want to actually, do that, then you'll need a permit for that process. So the planning scheme is not doing this just to be complicated. It's trying to actually remove the constant need for a permit if the decision has already been made, but it makes sure that a permit is required if we need to be very careful about what happens on that land. So we'll reinforce this. And I'll make a comment right now that when you're new to this material, we usually find it takes 3 or 4 weeks of, what's happening? And then people sort of get the aha moment a few weeks in and it starts to fit together. So if you feel a little overwhelmed now, don't worry. I've been doing this for about 20 years. Generally speaking, if you stick with it, it works out. And actually it becomes more fun as you start to use the thing, because it's not just the rules really, it's about what that means for planning and city building and change and heritage and all those matters that we deal with in the Act and the planning scheme. Okay, so this is an important one as well, the objectives of planning, and you'll be able to recite this as a small prayer before sleep if you were to choose to do so, the objectives of planning in Victoria as set out in section 4. These are not just here for show, but they are there to guide the rest of the activities that happen in the planning system. Generally speaking, things do fit in, but if we come to a decision about what should be in and out of a planning scheme, for example, and when we modify the VPPs, we might need to go back to these objectives to really make important decisions. Or if, there's something, it's a bit of a line call, a discretionary grey area. These are the overarching objectives. And I'll kind of run through these semi-quickly, but there's some pretty big words in here, and these are fairly lofty ambitions. Fair, orderly, economic and sustainable use and development of land. Now, we've already run into a problem, I would say, because do we think that all land and the outcomes of that in Victoria are fair, orderly, economic and sustainable? It seems highly unlikely, doesn't it? However, these are the objectives, and as much as we can trade off all of the different objectives and the abilities we have, we would seek to do that. So I raise that not to sort of be a downer on, the lofty goals, but rather the reality And if we're not going for fairly high ideals, we'll fall even shorter. So you can see protection of natural and man-made resources, maintenance of ecological processes and genetic diversity, pleasant, efficient and safe working, living and recreational environment for visitors and Victorians. Conserve and enhance those building areas or other places of scientific, aesthetic, architectural or historic interest or otherwise special cultural value. To protect public utilities and other assets. To facilitate development in accordance with the objectives set out above. Now, F there, pretty important. This is pretty much saying we like development. We are going to be facilitating building stuff. Okay, so there's an assumption built into this that on the whole, if it meets the requirements of the Act and of the planning scheme and any other related matters, you've got the go-ahead. It's an overarching principle. Now, that might seem a little bit sort of almost aggressive in some terms. However, remembering what an Act is, this is expressing the law and the intent of the government of the day in which it was passed. There's an assumption that we want to facilitate development. Okay, so a lot of things flow out of that particular objective throughout the planning scheme. And it may not actually necessarily seem like it will always fit in to balance the present and future interests of all Victorians. So then, what are the objectives of the planning framework? So this is saying, okay, we're going to have a framework. A lot of that framework is around the processes and the planning scheme. Sound strategic planning and coordinated action at state, regional and municipal levels. This is also pretty important because it's saying, well, we're going to try and make the different activities and developments fit together. So there will be a school roughly where it's needed and accessible to people. There will be roads connecting the housing lots that have been divided up, that everyone gets a chance to drive onto a road from their property, and so forth. All of those amazingly complex things that make up a city, the planning scheme is going to try, and the Act are going to try and coordinate those processes. In fact, it's not just the Planning Act that does it. There's a Subdivision Act, there's water authorities, there's all of those other parts of the system, Transport Act, etc. And here, this is something you're going to be doing a lot of work on this semester. The establishment of a system of planning schemes as the principal way to set out objectives, policies and controls for use and development of land. So here, basically, this is saying there are going to be planning schemes, and they're going to be the main way that we're going to manage use and development in the state. And alongside that, we're going to integrate urban planning with a range of other things. I just discovered something that is perfect for my research project. I have funding from the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC to integrate urban planning with emergency management. And it's not actually on there, which is kind of interesting. So that might be point number 1 in my report that I write. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So, it seems a bit slavish going through these, but these have massive implications for the way the Act works and indeed for the way that the planning schemes work. And if you feel that, they're not that worried about environmental values and they really do favour development, well, that's because the Act sets out to do that. It's the law. It doesn't, it doesn't ignore those things, but there is an emphasis towards development. So consideration of an explicit consideration of social and economic effects. Ensure that those affected by proposals receive appropriate notice, so that's your third parties. Provide for enforcement, that means a mechanism to make people go along with the planning scheme. And compensation. I will say we do not have much compensation instances in Victoria, but there are some limited ones, such as when we resume land for a road or for some other purpose. Very uncommon in this particular system. Okay, let's have a break in about 15 minutes or so, but I'll move through fairly quickly, 20 minutes or so. Who are the actors? Who are the players in this game? I would put to you that the Planning Act is right in the middle of all this. It's not saying, that developers and applicants don't have a lot of agency, but this way of thinking, the planning law and statutory planning way of thinking, has the Act as central because it is the law, and everyone in the planning system must comply with the Act and with planning schemes. Even the minister must comply with the Act, although he or she is given considerable what might be called extraordinary powers. They still have to work within the law as it stands. That's important. So we've got people who want to do things, applicants for permits and proponents for scheme amendments, the public, the responsible authority, they process permits, the minister, just talked about, the planning authority, they do scheme amendments. It's both of those ones, the PA and the RA, are local government most of the time, like the City of Yarra, the City of Melbourne, and so forth, and a whole range of other government agencies. That might be road agencies, catchment management agencies, water bodies, telcos, transport agencies, the Country Fire Authority, and so forth. So, as we go through, I hope you start to get a picture for how the Act sets out all these roles, responsibilities, scope of what counts and what doesn't in the Victorian planning system. So now, we'll just have a look at the Minister. They are big players in all of this. And it's a pretty big deal in government to be the Minister for Planning. Quite a bit of power, quite a bit of influence. People may not like you. Developers probably love you or pretend to because you might help them a lot. I'm not saying in illegal ways, it's just the way the process works. So Mary Delahunty, a former journalist, Justin Madden, a former footballer, being a bit naughty with that because actually pretty cool because he was a top level footballer and an architect and being in his politics, pretty cool. I can't play football, so I'm in awe. Matthew Guy, who's now the Minister for the Leader of the Opposition, and Mr Wynne, who's the current Minister. In this state, planning matters can win and lose elections for state governments. It's a big deal, and the ministers play a pretty large part of this in that they have extraordinary powers. They can give roles to people, they approve, they have the final approval power of all planning schemes and all changes to planning schemes. It's a big deal. They can change the basic blueprint of planning schemes, the VPP, the Victoria Planning Provisions. They can just make scheme amendments themselves or tell other people to do it. If they want, if they think a planning agency, like a local government, isn't doing their job properly, they can take their powers from them and the Minister can install a commissioner to take over that role. And the one that is getting more and more contentious, they have calling powers. If they think it is of state significance or importance, they can call in a planning permit application and make a decision themselves. So this is pretty powerful stuff. Okay. The Planning Authority, Section 12. So the Planning Authority is the group that can make a planning scheme. Most of the time, it's a municipal agency or local government or council, people often call it. As I said, City of Yarra, City of Melbourne, City of Stonington, and so forth. And in making changes to a planning scheme through amendments, they must be achieving the objectives of planning as set out in the Act and in the States section. So I'm going to take you through that in a bit of detail. And if the Minister wants, he or she can authorise another Minister or a public authority to prepare a planning scheme.
Who actually voted? Who decides if
So the Minister's powers stem from the Act, and in the past, under the Rob McClellan years of the 90s, the Minister for Planning was Rob McClellan, who was also the Minister for Local Government. And that was the period in which, and so that was the law. They legally had a whole lot of powers in those two acts, the Planning Act and the Local Government Act, and they actually kicked out a whole bunch of local governments at that time because they didn't think that they were playing the game as they saw fit to do so. But this is an act of Parliament, so it's the democratic output of a given government, so 1987, and the minister gets the power out of that. He or she is legally able to do things. So I'll take you to some of those in particular, but if you wanted to look up Section 20, Part 4, you will find a very, very powerful component of the minister's powers. Okay, so when someone is amending the planning scheme or preparing a brand new planning scheme, they must have regard to the direction of the minister, use the Victoria planning provisions, which are the blueprint, and I'll take you directly to that, and have regard to all the strategies and other things that might have an impact. Okay, so the other one, and I'm sorry these are two concepts you've got to grapple with, but they're very important to remember that they have different names and quite different roles and responsibilities. The responsible authority is the one who deals with planning permit applications. So basically you're just using the scheme as it is, and you say, can I please have a permit to build a residential tower block, in simple terms. So the kicker in this is usually it's the same body, local government, that is playing one or other of these roles. But their powers and responsibilities and duties are different depending whether they're being the responsible authority or the planning authority. So you need to work out which entity or what range of responsibilities and powers they're taking on in a given moment, because it invokes different components of the Act. Clear as mud? We'll keep reinforcing that. So they administer and enforce the planning scheme, so if someone's not complying with it, but generally speaking, it's permits that take up 99% of their time, processing permits. So sometimes the minister can take on that role, but normally it's local government, and they have to comply with the scheme and the Act like everyone else. They don't have special powers. And Section 16, application of planning schemes. If you look there, you'll see the planning scheme is binding on every minister, government department, public authority and municipal council. So this is important because some other places you'll go in the world, you'll find they've sort of got these extraordinary powers. We've chosen to go down a path where the planning scheme is to provide a level of certainty for the public and various agencies that there can't be people coming in and doing strange things. That said, there are kind of ways around it sometimes. The other thing I'll point out there, planning schemes apply to all land in Victoria. Anywhere within the state of Victoria has a planning scheme applying to it, which means everywhere has a zone and all of the other tests that apply to the planning scheme. This is important because other states in Australia don't have that same approach. So sometimes you'll go somewhere, there's no planning scheme applying in those locations. So we've taken a different approach here in that sense. Land in this sense means water as well. So lakes, rivers, swamps, etc. are also included. Okay, so thinking of that image I showed you, the spokes on a wheel, other actors. So developers, home builders, shopkeepers, offices, they're all affected by the planning scheme. And if you apply to do something, say to demolish, if you're required to apply for that, the Planning Act provides quite a high level of certainty that the same process applies to everyone. This is very intentional so that people have faith in the system. There's much less corruption out of that. I won't say there's no corruption in the planning system, but it's pretty limited in Australian planning systems, mainly because we've got very, very clear processes. And many of you may be from other places where that's not exactly the case, because a lot of money to be made out of land development and getting permits and things like that. So we generally don't suffer too much from that, although later in the semester I'll show you some examples. So if we make a decision as an applicant, we usually have a right of review, what we used to call an appeal. So I can say, I don't think that was correct. Please can we go to a higher body? So there are many processes like that. Again, they're set out in the Act. If you go to section 58 of the Act, you'll find something that, again, I would suggest is quite important. Anyone who makes a planning application and that application is complete, as in you're not missing the drawings and whatever's required to be put in and the fee, if you put in a legitimate application, it must always be considered by the responsible authority. And it says that at section 58. Why would that be the case? Yeah, it stops bias. It's fair, So whoever it is, you say, well, I don't like that guy, he's got a scraggly beard and he's not to be trusted, well, that won't apply. Or, we had a bad run-in with that guy in the past. Well, too bad. The Act says you must accept all applications that come in. So you'll see lots of mechanisms in the Act that try to provide certainty and try to provide a level of fairness as we go through. I'm not really saying it's completely fair, but some of the procedures seek to be as fair as possible in the treatment of different parties. The other thing I'll say straight away here, and this is important, many things are simply allowed without a permit in the planning system. The reason I point this out is because a lot of people assume everything needs a permit. But for example, if you're in the general residential zone on a large lot with no overlays, you don't need a planning permit because we've already zoned it for dwellings. So unless it's over 4 stories or there's some other unusual quality to that land, you just go ahead and get a building permit. You don't need a planning permit because we've already zoned it for dwellings on the whole in that general residential zone. So one of the other functions that the planning scheme is trying to do is to avoid unnecessary permit applications because we do the background work first. However, since I started as a planner, which was a little while ago now, much more stuff needs a permit. More and more stuff requires a permit now. So the Act was about this thick, about less than a centimetre thick, and the planning scheme was about a centimetre thick. Now that's the Act feels a lot heavier. The planning schemes are like 50 times bigger. It's a much more complicated system, so more things need permits. But the other thing I would point out now is that the planning system operates with the assumption that all structures will get a building permit. Different legislation, and usually it happens after the planning permit process operates. So that's something to remember. I'll talk in a while about what the building process does so you can discern between the two. But generally speaking, building permits are about structural integrity and human health and safety matters. So we know it's connected to sewerage pipes, and we know the structure's not going to collapse, and we know people aren't going to fall off high buildings because there's no balustrade, and so on and so forth. So the planning system assumes that that will happen after we give, if we do give, planning permits. And then we've got the other actor of the wider public. All of those people who might ignore the planning process, or they might be deeply involved because they live next door, or they're another developer, or they just live there, or they've got a particular interest, say in the environment, and so forth. And there are many opportunities in the Victorian planning system, perhaps the most in the world, by my estimation, to lodge objections and to lodge submissions. As in, yes, this is a great scheme amendment, or I object to this permit application and here's why. So we'll look at those in a bit more detail too. The other thing is that there are many other activities that can occur outside of the Act, and they're not wrong or anything, particularly things like lobbying. Lobbying is when you might try to influence the position of an elected member of well, any government body effectively, but usually in planning it's a local government politician, an elected councillor. And you might say, I live in, Hollyoaks Lane, and I think that new development's absolutely appalling and the whole street does, and you should vote against it because. And that's entirely legitimate, but the planning system doesn't really take so much notice of that political lobbying. It does take notice of objections because the Act says so. So that's not to say lobbying is wrong. In fact, you should probably do it because it's part of democracy. But the planning system kind of ignores it. Okay, so, and there's a whole range of processes, and I'm just looking at the time to get through. I won't go through all these in detail now because we'll deal with them in coming weeks. But generally speaking, some key things are also set out in the Act. If people have a legal right to make a submission or make an objection, the planning process requires that decision makers take them into account, not just ignore them. So they might not agree. They might say, oh, this guy shouldn't get a permit because he's an idiot. No, well, we'll think about that, but actually we'll ignore it because that's not a valid planning reason. But if it was to say that this building is 5 stories, and in the planning scheme that area is restricted to 4 stories at clause whatever, then you go, good point, we will take that into account. So another example of how there's a legal process set out, and generally it's to try and make sure things are fair, but also using the logic of the Planning Act and the planning scheme. Then we have all of the different agencies. They might be formal, VicRoads, Melbourne Water, or they might be other related agencies as well, and it could even be the adjacent municipality who's right next door, and we want to let them have a say as well. So there's the key actors again. They've all got certain roles set out. We'll go to some of those in more detail, but I'm going to talk now about, after the break, we'll talk more about the wider planning system in which the Act works. So if you could be back at 15 minutes past 6, 6:15 please, and we'll have a fair bit to cover through that period. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. So I want now to just take a pause from things being so focused on the Act and the regulation to find some context for this and just to locate these legally based processes within a wider context. And I won't spend a huge amount of time on it, but I think it is necessary to consider these things. Now, we've got global planning of sorts. It's not particularly extensive, but this generally occurs through agreements, sometimes through financial mechanisms of things being built in various ways, and sometimes legal or protocols that have been signed. So can anyone think of an example of a global planning sort of mechanism? There's one over there you might have done an exam in if you've done exam. World Heritage, exactly, yeah. So these are agreements effectively, but they will have impacts on land use and development. but as I say, they're not particularly extensive. What might be another one? UN, which bit of the UN? I'm trying to think of a UN bit that has that impact actually. Yes, doesn't happen here so much, but absolutely in many other countries that can have a big impact. Yeah, exactly right. Another one might be Ramsar, which deals with migratory birds, and in fact there's some really nice examples west of the city here. So not a huge thing. At national scale, and I'm coming to Australia more directly here, there's not formally a planning system at the national level in Australia. This is a function of our federated system where the powers of planning are at a state level, this legislation here. However, some things that happen at national level in Australia have implications for planning and are in a sense a type of planning. And one might be large project funding. We've had a few goes at this over the years and it's a little bit sporadic. Building Better Cities program was one of them in the early 80s. We have large road funding projects that can have huge implications for the planning of cities and so forth. Or it might be things that have impacts at the micro scale that extend out. For example, the first home buyers scheme, which gives concessions to first home buyers, as in like worth $10,000 or $20,000, depending what era we're in, and that can have huge implications on land supply and demand, and indeed on the rate of growth and change. So, as I say, not too much there. The state is where most of the legal powers extend from, as in Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, etc., because that's what the Constitution says, where we can have the Acts of Parliament, the legal basis for it. Generally speaking, that's been okay, but it has made it quite challenging in Australia to deal with national issues, often of equity or trying to direct growth in various locations that are meaningfully linked with often economic or social or environmental matters. So we do have the Environmental Protection Biodiversity, EPBC, Biodiversity and Conservation Act. That is a national act. Generally that affects only environmental matters. Obviously that can have some impacts for planning as articulated in the different acts. Then we have regional and metropolitan planning. This is done quite differently in different parts of Australia, but generally speaking, we're not very good at it. Generally speaking, there's not much there. Western Australia explicitly sets out in the legislation regional planning, but here in Victoria, we don't really have a component of the Act that speaks to regional planning. So regional planning is the level above individual settlements and below the level of the state. And traditionally around the world, regional planning has been used to try and direct growth and population and investment and transport systems into different locations to try and stimulate growth or to make fair the outcomes in different places. We haven't really gone down that path because when we were sort of ready for that process, we had a big change of government. This is the Whitlam years for Australian people, where regional planning was seen as a bit of a socialist thing, and it got taken, all the powers to do that kind of got taken away, and we never really got them back till now. Ma'am. The state has been reluctant to do that because, as in this is the state, say of Victoria, just to clarify the term, we have a long history of regional planning not working. So we've tried to push development into various places and it hasn't really worked, and it's often ended up in kind of a waste of money or a bit of a planning failure. But also, it's probably that one of the big drivers is, and one of the big forces that acts on regional planning here is that we have a huge primacy of capital cities in Australia. And often regional planning, when you look at it logically, you'd say, why don't we push people into regional areas and support them and have jobs out there where housing will be cheaper? And it all sounds lovely and logical. But then the pull of the prime cities, Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Brisbane, is kind of overwhelming without, you know, becoming a complete command and control planning system. So, and as I say, the real strength of planning was building in the 1960s and 70s in Australia. Before that, it was fairly fundamental. And then after that big push in the 70s for regional planning, then we had a series of right-wing governments that just didn't want to take it on. And now the left and the right have kind of come together as a neoliberal approach to planning. Yes, okay. Yes, it would. And I would point out that WA actually has a regional planning system of sorts. It's probably the most coherent in Australia because it's got actual powers set out in the Act. WA is so big, and they're trying to reallocate where growth and, you know, the goods and bads of development kind of go. It's a huge challenge. Okay, and then we have local planning. Oh, and I might point out metropolitan. Here in Australia, of course, as I was saying before, our metropolitan areas are so big compared to the rest of the states that metropolitan planning is kind of, while normally we'd think of it as a type of regional planning, metropolitan planning here consumes most of the time and energy of planning agencies, which sounds awful, and it probably is awful. So, you know, planning for Melbourne at a metropolitan level is an all-consuming thing that we do quite badly. So that tends to happen in each state of Australia, unfortunately. Then we have local planning. Local planning is where the rubber hits the road, where the real force of planning applies in Australian states and indeed in Victoria, because that is the level at which planning schemes apply. So we have all the acts and we have the big policies and all of those sorts of things, but if you want to know, can I build my factory here, or can I build a house there, can I demolish that heritage site, where do you go? The local planning scheme. So that's where the real force of planning, all this stuff we do in the state-based act, that's where it actually takes force. That's where it derives its force. It might be informed by higher level policy, but and indeed most planners are employed at local government level, although nowadays we have lots of consultants who work in various places. So a lot of our time in this class over the next 11 weeks will focus on a local planning instrument, the planning scheme. Of course, we try to make all the different local schemes integrate, but there are many challenges to that. And then, of course, we have micro plans of various scales where you know, we might have a specific planning control for a specific place or purpose. So now we're going to look at how we would prepare a planning scheme. And I would point out here that we use some terms a little bit loosely in Australian planning, and the Minister and DELP, that's the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, as the metropolitan sort of, well, they have the metropolitan plan as part of their views, and it might be Plan Melbourne that embodies that policy. And generally speaking, we talk about strategic planning as this higher level planning that might try to steer direction a little bit differently through some of its policies. So you might be familiar with the 20-minute concept, the 20-minute city as set out in Plan Melbourne, which is the metropolitan plan, and that intends to influence planning schemes to try and make sure a given individual has access to most of their daily needs within 20 minutes of travel, by whatever means that might be. So generally speaking, when we're talking about strategic planning, that's what we're talking about. But if you're a strategic planner in local government, you're generally working in the role or assisting the role of planning authority, which is modifying the planning scheme, doing scheme amendments, changing the rules that apply in a place effectively. Statutory planning is the implementation component, where there's an existing set of rules and we say, yes, that gets a permit because it complies, or no, it doesn't, or you can get a permit if you change what you want to do a little bit. So that's the implementation part. We call that statutory planning. I don't think the terms are strictly accurate, but that's what people use, and we'll use those terms as well.
When you say town planning,
Town planning is a catch-all. That's good. I've been using that a little bit loosely in some ways. We generally in the academy talk about urban planning or urban and regional planning as the catch-all term for the people and the processes that try and modify physical outcomes to achieve social, economic and ecological objectives. And it's a catch-all phrase, but it's generally things that happen in the Planning and Environment Act in some way. So that's the Academy's word. If you go out and get a job, you'll be employed as a town planner. So we've stuck with that old-fashioned term. Sometimes now you see some people call it urban planning, but you know, I think most of the jobs I've had have been a town planner, or in the UK, town and country planner. If you're in the US, maybe city planner. You know, the terms vary a little bit. So when I'm saying town planning, I'm generally using that as an overarching term. So statutory planning is essentially using the planning scheme, enforcing it, processing permit applications are the main jobs that you would do. And the idea of having a statutory plan, a planning scheme, is that it gives force, it makes rules to achieve the big strategies. So if we're concerned about loss of ecologically sensitive vegetation, one of the key mechanisms, you know, there are big policies about that, one of the key ways we'd actually achieve it is by having controls in the planning scheme that require a permit or simply prohibit the clearing of native vegetation, for example, or you know, farmland being used in certain ways and so forth. So the statutory scheme is there to achieve the big picture through the permitting process or prohibiting things. So let's have a look at a planning scheme. I didn't bring a hard copy with me because this was already heavy enough. But what is a planning scheme? If we break it right down, we've got the words, which are the rules and the policies, and we've got the pictures, which spatialise things. So they spatialise it, where things are in space, you know, on maps. Happens to be the Mornington Peninsula. I'll talk more about the different planning schemes in a while. But generally speaking, the two need to go together for it to work, because one zone will apply in place A, a different zone in place B, and so forth. So this is a core principle of statutory planning, is that we'll have maps and then decision rules effectively. So if you really try and boil down what is urban planning in a statutory sense, it's decisions. It's kind of as simple and as complicated as that. It's about decision making in different places according to the circumstances. So in a heritage area, in an environmentally sensitive area, in the middle of the CBD, various different decision processes will be in place. It'll have all kinds of implications for the environment, for economic prosperity, and so forth. In Victoria, there's essentially a blueprint, or a template, you could say, and we call that the Victoria Planning Provisions. It doesn't actually apply anywhere on its own, but it's the background document that is translated into a planning scheme for a specific authority. So the City of Mornington, the Shire of Mornington Peninsula, for example, they get this suite of pre-given controls and they adapt them for their authority. Okay? And the VPP provide a mechanism. Now, does anyone remember who's in charge of the VPP? It's the Minister. Okay? Yeah, that's probably a good answer for lots of things I'll ask. But who's evil? No. But this provides a mechanism to control many key elements of all of the planning schemes in the whole state. And sometimes the minister will decide to change state planning policy, and when he or she does that, it changes all state planning policy in every scheme. Like that. So that's a very powerful mechanism. It has a lot of good and bad things about it, but generally speaking, it's seeking to provide consistency and fairness and some efficiencies, because if you can understand one planning scheme, you can kind of understand them all with a little bit of adaptation. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about, most of the time, the most important skill you can have in planning, and in a lot of different disciplines, property developer, environmental activist, statutory planner, is to understand the planning scheme. Because that lets you know what can and can't happen on a piece of land and why. So let's have a think about the planning scheme. Some of the fundamentals. All land in Victoria must be in a zone. Can't have blank bits in the map, except for Commonwealth land, which is the exception. We don't have too many examples of that. Army bases, things like this might be in Commonwealth land. So we also have overlays, and these so we have say we've got a zone here, we might have overlays that go on top of it, and there might be multiple overlays on a given piece of land. Zones deal with use. That's the activity that occurs on the land. Overlays deal with development. So this is why I was making a bit of a fuss about the difference between the two. There is a little bit of crossover, but if you remember generally that, you've gone a long way to using the planning scheme already. So zones are for use and overlays for development. So some places we're not too worried about the details and we just live with the zone. Other places like the Mornington Peninsula Shire, you can go, and some places have got like 10 overlays on them for various reasons. But when you boil it all down, say I'm a developer, what do I want to know? Do I need a permit? Or is a permit required? Or is it even just prohibited? It's probably the most powerful bit of the planning scheme, because it tells you what can and can't happen. So it boils right down to that. So sometimes, I said before, it's about decisions. Sometimes the decision's already made, as in it's prohibited in that zone, or you don't even need a permit, go ahead in that zone. It's kind of like a predetermined decision through the initial planning process of zoning or having overlays. But where most of the work occurs is in permit required, because permit required says maybe. You'll have to lodge an application and we're going to look at the detail. And most of the work in the responsible authority role is around running the process of will they get a permit or not, and what will be the conditions. And the Act sets out in very careful steps what happens through that process, because as soon as an application is lodged, it kicks in a legal process that's set out in the Act. So the scheme sets out a series of tests that should be used, and stat planners use the Act and planning scheme. So if we look at the planning scheme, and I'll go through this in very general terms first to give you the overview of it. The VPPs, so that's the background to all planning schemes across the state, have a state planning policy framework. So this is higher level policy that applies everywhere. And a range of things in there. These are big picture policy directions. Sustainable development, settlements, activity centres, etc. All of the big policies are set out in there, and some of those policies reference Plan Melbourne, for example. And there's the connection between Plan Melbourne as a policy for metropolitan change and growth and maintenance and quality into the planning scheme. So in effect, it gives a level of force to Plan Melbourne in a statutory sense. So remember I was saying, you know, where does the power come from? Where is it written down? You always need to know that. Otherwise, that policy document would just be floating around and it wouldn't have any real force. So that thinking is really, really important. So State Planning Policy Framework, SPPF. And you will see here an extract. Actually, this may not be completely up to date, but it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. You'll see here in the introduction to the SPPF, the purpose of state policy and planning schemes is to inform planning authorities and responsible authorities of those aspects which they are to take into account and give effect to in planning and administering their areas. Provides a context for spatial planning and decision making, etc. So, you know, this starts big, and as you go through the planning scheme, in many ways it gets down to the tiny little details on the whole. Now, I'll point something out now. That is a clause number. So if I say clause 10.01 or whatever, I'm talking about the planning scheme. So if you sort of lock that in, it saves you a lot of struggles. Yeah, this has been changed a little bit, but it doesn't matter. And you'll see here, another thing I'll point out, it has a date and VC 71. Does anyone know what that is there for? Have a guess. When it was updated. Bang on. Okay? So this can be relevant sometimes for going back historically to understand decision making, but it can also just make sure you're using the up-to-date one if you're using it as the basis for information. Oh, I beg your pardon. VC 71 is Victorian councils, and just number 71, it goes through sequentially. So if it says VC, it means it applies to all councils in Victoria. And there's some other nomenclature I will show you as we go through. But it just started at number 1, so it just went sequentially through. And you can go looking for the exact detail and the whole report behind that to understand why that was put in as different to what was there before. Oh, I pointed it out there, yeah. So you can see that's another one. So the planning scheme does change pretty regularly. It is not static, and so it's a reflection of the government of the day, as new growth pressures happen, as we get more evidence coming in based on studies, you name it. So there's lots of stuff coming on. So that one's about settlement, this one's about activity centres and the network of activity centres, and so on and so forth. So urban growth, supply of land, and it goes on. And while the planning scheme has its own logic and it covers a lot of ground, there are some moves afoot right now to say it is simply too big and too complicated for even experts to meaningfully use. I don't know if the bureaucrats will manage to squash it down, but there is talk about it right now. So I won't go through these too slavishly, but you get the idea. So planning for growth areas there, see VC 71 in 2010, and then VC 106, it was changed in 2014, just to illustrate. So these things change over time. Okay, Metropolitan Melbourne, and so on and so forth. So you can see this one's a bit older, for example, and it refers to an old metropolitan planning scheme. So this wouldn't actually apply right now, Melbourne 2030. Okay, so, and then we have a regional settlement framework. This is not a very extensive thing, regional planning in Victoria. It is an element that is being worked on now, and it is expected that this will become much more sophisticated, but it hasn't been going very quickly, I might add. So I'm not sure if that'll change too fast. Okay, so that was the state policy, the big picture stuff, which is meant to generally guide what we do. Then we go down a level, local planning policy framework. This is the chance that a responsible authority and a planning authority, like Mornington Peninsula Shire, for them to adapt the VPPs to their particular needs. To say, okay, we're unique, we've got farmland, we've got beaches, we've got tourism, you know, so on and so forth, and here's how we want our planning scheme to be to respond to this particular place. And the first part of it is called the Municipal Strategic Statement. It sets out their general directions and where they want to go, and you can see it's broad brush. You know, where settlement is generally going. I don't think that copied particularly well, but it's not meant to be super accurate. It's meant to guide the overall vision for this particular municipality. And then we get local policy that actually starts to set out decision rules. So what is a policy? It's an if-then. It's a, in certain circumstances, you should do this, or must do this, or you must not do this. So policies are decision processes, in effect. Sometimes very prescriptive, sometimes very open and discretionary. And when preparing amendments to this scheme and before making decisions about permit applications, PAs and RAs must take the LPPs into account, local planning policy. And you see here, you know, here's one, for example, Aboriginal cultural heritage. And they set it out, and the language is intentionally quite precise. This policy applies to all land. That's important because sometimes a policy might only apply to even one site, for example, because it's important. So where does it apply to? You get the background of the policy, and then here are the words. It is policy that. You have to take these things into account and make a decision with this information in front of you. So that format and that way of setting it out is really important, and you need to look for it when you're working in the role of statutory planner in some sense. And we would call these decision criteria. How do we decide about things? So sometimes there's numbers, and you know, sets out setbacks for how far things should be from the boundary and how high. Sometimes it might invoke another process, or it might require us as professionals to exercise our discretion. But many components of the planning scheme revolve around us identifying what are the things we need to make a decision about, using what criteria, from height to aesthetics to Aboriginal heritage, inputs from other parties and so forth. It's a good question. Going back to one of the things the planning scheme seeks to do is to coordinate activities of different parties and of different objectives. So this is here effectively to try and make planning scheme decisions taking into account another agency, as in Aboriginal Victoria, and that whole range of legislation that exists as well. So they would be linked, that's right. And there are many other examples of attempts and requirements to coordinate between different agencies and parties throughout the planning system. So one of the big things a planning scheme tries to do is to coordinate. So, you know, the roads go well, heritage is treated well, you know, in the two ways. And sometimes one agency will take precedence, sometimes they will operate in tandem, so to speak. So I'll give you more examples. Yeah. Good pickup. Okay, so zones. This is often what people think of when they think of planning. And indeed, it is a pretty powerful component. Maybe it's the most important component. It's a very blunt instrument, I would say, but it's important and it's very powerful. And, you know, whether or not you're in a public park and recreation zone or a residential one zone is the difference between whether or not you're allowed to build a house or have a park for public purposes, and, you know, a range of other things. So if I were a developer and my zoning changed, it could have huge implications for how much money I could make, or it might have huge implications for whether or not ecologically important vegetation gets removed, and so on and so forth. So many of the main decisions in the planning system are in the zones. And as I said before, they spatialise the rule system. Okay, so there's the zones. Everything in Victoria is zoned. And you'll notice one thing, that this is on top of this slightly jagged looking base plan. So we've got the colours, which are the zones, and with these acronyms, road zone 2, special use zone 2, etc. These all relate to sets of decision criteria in the text of the planning scheme. But underneath, what are these squiggly lines here? They're lots and road reserves on the whole. Okay? So there's a link back into what we call the cadastre, and that is effectively the map that relates to certificates of title. In this country, under the Torrens system we call it, if you own a piece of land, you have a certificate which describes the land, exactly where it is and how big it is and its boundaries, with a little diagram of the shape of the lot with all of the dimensions, and it's got your name on it if you own it, and a mortgage and things like that, and maybe some caveats which might modify its use or covenants. It's called a certificate of title, and the Surveyor General has the role of putting all of those titles together in a cadastral map, the cadastre called. And when we have zones and overlays, we use the cadastre, which is all very carefully measured by surveyors, and now with global positioning systems and all that kind of stuff. We use that as the basis for the zoning map, like a lot of other things in government, actually. So it's quite precise. And you'll notice that almost all the time we put the boundaries of zones on the lines on the cadastre. So we assume, generally speaking, it's pretty unusual this is not the case. Even though that's a big fat line there, the exact difference between those two zones is, well, in a sense, it's infinitely small, isn't it? Because it's a division between two lots of land. Okay, so almost always we put those on the cadastral boundaries. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, so if it were in contention, you'd get a copy of that certificate of title and you'd measure it really, really carefully with a surveyor. I used to be a surveyor, so I love that stuff, measuring things. Okay, so does that generally make sense? These are zones, and most of the time they're talking about use, which is the activities that occur. So,
and what happens when the cadastral map doesn't match the zoning map, like in that PRZ square?
well, it does match it, but it just assumes that that road reserve is also zoned public parks and recreation. Do you see what I mean? So, is that the thing you're pointing to?
I meant more like the upper side.
Yeah. I don't know if there's a cadastral boundary underneath that or not. I would say there probably is. There usually is. But if you really aren't sure, you go back to the original scheme amendment where all those dimensions are provided. So I'll take you to those reports where it describes where the zone applies in very precise detail. Yep. Okay. So, residential one zone, that sort of peach colour it looks like there, a range of things you can and can't do and need permits in there and so forth. So those acronyms and colours essentially make a link into the text itself. So look there, residential one zone, R1Z. I wonder if I can build, I don't know, a house there. And then you go to the zone and it says shown on the planning scheme map as R1Z. I know that sounds kind of slavish, but the planning scheme has these very precise ways, so there's absolutely no doubt when we're making decisions, because this has huge implications for the value of the land and what can and can't happen for all kinds of reasons. And then the zone has a purpose to implement the state planning policy framework and the local planning policy and so forth. But this one has a specific purpose to provide for residential development at a range of densities with a variety of dwellings to meet housing needs of households. It's one of the big things that we try to provide for, not the only thing. But also, they're saying, well, it's actually not going to be just houses. We want educational, recreation, religious, community, and other uses to serve local community needs. So, corner shops and a church or a mosque or a synagogue or whatever, can be there as well. There might be constraints on that, but we know that people want those things in residential areas. Okay, and I beg your pardon. It's residential one zone. That zone is actually redundant now, but you'll still find lots of maps with R1Z written on it because we've introduced some different zones. So now we call that the general residential zone, but you'll see they write here, it might be shown on the map as GRZ, R1Z, R2, etc. So again, it's a bit of a pain. The planning system has lots of these little things. So part of using the planning system is often just sort of working your way through things and carefully thinking about what it might mean and making the links. So overlays, it's another thing that is a map. This might be a bit hard to read, but it says vegetation protection overlay number 1. So it's saying in these areas, not the ones that are out, but the ones that are in, VPO1 applies. And underneath this is a zone. I'm guessing it's general residential zone, but it could be commercial or whatever. Here's probably general residential. So this goes over the top and it introduces another type of control, in this case to do with vegetation protection. It's got its purposes, and look here again, permit is required to remove, destroy or lop any vegetation, etc. So it invokes that. So again, thinking the statutory way, where does it say I need a permit? What are the decision criteria? How do we decide? So you have to keep going looking for this stuff. Actually, this actually is a core skill, and almost if you can do this, you can get a job in a planning office or a developer's agency. It's one of the core things that we do. You can send me checks later. Very reluctant laugh, yeah. That's not a binding contract, it's okay. So, and then we have particular provisions. So zones and overlays are fairly big picture stuff. They catch a range of activities, uses and development. We have specific things that we target. An example here that I use because it's something I made a mistake on way back in 1996 was a heliport. And it says here, you need a permit to use or develop land for a heliport or helipad, even if it is ancillary to another use on the land. Why is that? Because back in the mid-90s we had this proliferation of heliports in sensitive areas. So for rich people, businesses, hospitals, etc. And at some point we said, hang on, we've got to control this. So this new provision was introduced to say, all right, maybe you can do it, but we want to have a think if it's going to bother, say, a primary school right next door, or an old person's home, or whatever it might be, and we'll make a decision on that basis. So that's an important element as well. We'll go for another 10 or so minutes, okay? Now it gets a little bit, I get to move around. So general provisions, these apply generally, and most of the time it's about how to use the planning scheme, these general provisions, how to understand the decision guidelines. Clause 65 is really important, and it says a couple of important things. Because a permit can be granted does not imply that a permit should or will be granted. This is a fundamental principle of the planning scheme. The planning system is not a licensing system. The planning system retains the right to refuse things. And if you've run the process properly, it is legally possible to refuse things that are in a grey area. And essentially, permit required is a grey area. That's the nature of that. So some people are very surprised to find this. They think that they're just getting a licence for something, like a driver's licence or a fishing licence is a great example. You need to pay the fee, you get it, you do it. There's no questions in it. Planning system, its only real power actually is in the ability to say no, or yes if you do other things that we want to be changed about what you're planning to do. So, so that's an important principle, and it guides a lot of thinking in the planning system, that you might get a refusal if you're in this permit required space. And then these are the things that a responsible authority must think about when it is making a decision. I won't go through all of those, but you can see there's a wide range of things there to think about. And here's the space where professional discretion is exercised within a wider policy framework. And if we didn't have those kind of discretionary things, the computer would already be doing it. You know, it wouldn't need intellect and experience to apply it, and attention to the particularities of an individual place. So that's important. The other element of the planning scheme are the definitions. So we have a few definitions in the Act, but when you go to looking at land uses, I have never counted them up. There might be 100 definitions, maybe more, of different uses that are defined. These are important because in different zones, we say some uses are no permit required, some require a permit, and some are flat out prohibited. Okay, so childcare, can't put that in industrial, you know. Large church, you might be able to put that in residential. We're going to have a look at it, make sure it's not too big and doesn't make too much noise and too much traffic, and so forth. And all of these different uses are defined as much as possible in the definitions at clause 72. So, you know, this is just the aids, and it goes further. Okay, so the assignment. It is a bit different from last year, and it demonstrates a basic understanding of how to use the planning scheme. So we just started that this week, of course, in the lecture, and we'll continue to do that. But this assignment intends to work out if you can determine the zone, the overlay, you know, what sort of things are likely to go in a given place. And it's a bit of a starter kit for probably one of the most important things you can do in a planning scheme, or with a planning scheme, is to just understand what planning controls in a given place. Will there be a height limit? Are you allowed to build residential buildings there? You know, etc. So it's 2,000 words maximum, and I've asked the tutors to select a site for each of the tut groups, their own tut groups respectively. They probably won't tell you tonight, but they'll probably tell you before or actually on in the tut next week. It's up. I leave that to them because they can run their own process to take you through to it. So do worksheet 1 carefully before you start the assignment. Okay, but I just wanted to tell you now so you can start thinking about it. Mainly also I'll start getting questions about it right now, so I'll just tell you. So you take that site that you've been provided in class, and the first component is to understand the site and the general area. So who's got a design background? Must be a few people. Okay, so one of the things you do when you start working up a design, what do? You go to the context of the place. You understand all its peculiarities and particularities and generalities, what's going on, is it in a dynamic change situation, and so forth. site context. So the planning system has a similar way of doing things, and really what we want to know now in part one is that you can understand that. Because it's not just about the rules and regulations, it's about how they apply to a place and the dynamism of that place as well. So many of the things in the planning scheme that you'll see require the planner to actually understand the place as well as applying the rules. So you can read that yourselves, of course, but that's what you're seeking in that part one. It's three parts in it. Part two, here's where we get to the rules. What planning provisions apply to that particular address? The zone, the overlay, etc. But here, the second part of part two is putting together the context of the place with the planning rules. Okay, so just because you might be able to, I'm running with a theological theme here, just because you might have a place of worship there, is that really likely in that location? You know, so I want you to, here's where you start putting together your knowledge of the rules with the reality and likelihood of things happening in a given place. Another example might be, even if you could build a tower block, if it's in a country town and the land value is quite low, we're probably not going to be building big tower blocks, are we? You know, so there's all these very practical matters of change in a place. Is it heritage in the area? You know, all of those sorts of things. So we're starting to put together the real world with the world of rules in the planning scheme. Now here's where we change phase again, and we start using our professional intellect, where we reflect on what this might mean. And I deliberately set here a somewhat ambiguous question, and if you want to do this well, you provide a considered intellectual kind of questioning of the planning system. We don't like town planners, there's that generic term again. We don't want town planners to be robots because we could just plug stuff into a bunch of algorithms. And in fact, we should watch out for that one. But actually, it's going to be pretty hard to get rid of practicing planners because we need people to bring together, place and rules and objectives. But also, we need people who can intellectually question the rules as they stand and think about, well, okay, I'm the new strategic planner in this municipality. I've been given the job of updating the planning scheme. Well, we need people who can think about things like this in an intellectual way to be the ones who might bring in, with council's approval, new planning controls. And this periodically happens. But also, thinking in this way might help you to understand the rules better for their good and bad. So there's no absolutely correct answer for this, but the good marks will be given to people who can show a considered and careful questioning of the good and bad things. We look here for clear, concise, you could probably call it most business style writing. Australian academic writing is probably the easiest way to go. And by that I would say we want paragraphs, you can have lists, but we always put a header on the list, full colon, but mostly you'll be working to writing paragraph responses to this. So your tutors can give you more guidance on that. You don't get a lot of words here, 2,000 words, so you should really be thinking about writing very, very well, and this opportunity to show a key part of statutory planning is clear, concise, precise writing. And if you want to point out a clause, set out the clause. So, it says it's prohibited here at clause whatever. So that's the kind of thinking that we want. Don't expect a huge amount of referencing, but if you do get to the point where you're quoting something or taking an idea, say from Stephen Rowley's book, which is a great book, well, reference it. Clauses, you can say clause 1301 of the Melbourne Planning Scheme. and thereafter you can just say the scheme. Okay, so that's the kind of writing that we want. You can put maps and photographs as much as you would wish to in there. It's pretty easy these days to put pictures in Word documents, isn't it? The other thing I would point out now is if you go to the site, and I would encourage you to do so, you need to take care of your personal safety in ways that we would expect adults to do so. So don't. So here's where, you know, my occupational health and safety responsibility ends at some point and it becomes yours. But it would require that you do watch out for cars when you're wandering around taking photos. That happens. But the other thing, just this is an important point, that you do assess risks, and that might be don't visit the site late at night and walk down back alleys and get into strife. Maybe go with your friends anyway, because it's probably more fun and you can have a discussion, but you can't collude, you can't do the same assignment. It's a very big part of Melbourne University to avoid that. And do not go onto private property. Important. You can photograph things, that's perfectly acceptable. If people complain, you're not really doing something wrong, but move away from the situation. You know, don't get into troubles. It's very rare that that happens. Okay, I'll let you go, guys. Thanks for that.